All right, welcome on in to the final installment of my top 15 series for fantasy positions in the 2025 fantasy drafts. This is for defense and special teams. I am Spencer Taylor, and you are watching Touchdown Talks. So before I do go any further, please feel free to hit subscribe and the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos covering fantasy or anything else NFL related as far as game predictions, game reactions, whatever you'd like. As a matter of fact, you can leave down below in the comment section. You can tell me anything you would like me to cover, anything you want me to react to. And I would love to cover anything that you are interested in me covering and talking about. Whether that's stuff to do with the Bears, the Packers, the Lions, the Vikings, any other team, the divisions. I will also soon this week, in the next few days, have my season predictions coming up. So stay tuned for that. But without further ado, let's get on into this video for you. I'm going to try to keep this one a little bit more short for you, but I will have timestamps down below in that bar and in the description so you can skip around to whatever parts of the video you are most interested in seeing. So for starting off this list for defense and special teams, before I get into number one, I do want to give some drafting advice for defense and special teams. If you're a veteran of fantasy, you're okay to skip this if you want to, but certainly if you've struggled in the past with defenses, stick around for just a second, because my advice for you with defense and special teams is don't stress. Don't overdraft defense. I've talked about it already many times in this series with quarterbacks, with tight ends, a lot of these positions really outside of wide receiver and running back, which make up more than half of the draft. These other positions that are a bit limited in how many players or whatever there is available to the position, there's a tendency to, once one goes off the board, there's a tendency for fantasy managers to snowball and freak out that, hey, I need to hurry and take my preferred player that's left on this position, because if I don't, there's going to be none left by the time I'm back up and drafting. Don't panic, and especially if you see somebody overdrafting a player or a position that's way above what the average should be. If you do want to get the best value out of each pick, generally you do want to be patient and wait till a better round and value. And with that, for defense, my advice specifically for defense is wait till like the last two rounds of the draft in general. Unless you are going to draft like the top three defenses on this list, maybe, if that, you really, and even them, for me in general, in all my drafts now for the last couple of years, I generally don't draft defense until like maybe the last three rounds. But this year, I'm really trying to keep myself to the goal of trying to have my defense be in one of the last two rounds, because honestly, for the most part, even if you have one of the best defenses on your team, defense and special teams for fantasy is so much based off of the matchup. Even if you have the quote-unquote best defense in the NFL that year, in fantasy, they might not be the best defense every single week. By the end of the season, their overall is going to be the best. But if you want to have the most points you can every single week out of that defensive spot, even if you've got that best defense in the league in actual football, in fantasy week to week, you're not necessarily going to always want that defense. For one, every defense is going to have a bye week, of course. And then two, again, it's very matchup based. So starting off with number one as an example, I do have the Denver Broncos. So they are going one overall on average for defense at an average draft position of 111 currently, which is really high for defenses. That's a high price. If you really do want to get these top couple defenses, fine. But in my opinion, you're wasting fantasy value that could be otherwise used for other positions that you need more depth on, or other stuff on. Defense just doesn't provide enough value in general, and on a consistent basis, even the top defenses do not stay consistent enough week to week to warrant drafting a defense that high. But for the Denver Broncos, the reason they're getting drafted so high is because they finished 2024 as the number one defense. They do have a stout unit. They've got some great all-pro players, including Patrick Surtain and all-pro defensive tackle Zach Allen. And they've bolstered up their defense with other talent, including Dre Greenlaw from the 49ers, and through other picks in the draft as well. Very few NFL defenses are as talented, and the one benefit to drafting the Broncos, which I will say makes it semi-fair for why they're getting drafted first overall. The average draft position for them is still pretty high for me. The other reason for this is that's good to draft the Broncos is their early matchups are favorable. Week 1 and 2, they are going to be playing the Titans at home and on the road against the Colts. Both teams that I do not expect to be very good. I do think the Titans could be somewhat surprising by the end of the year, but early on in the season, I don't expect them to play very well. And certainly against a veteran head coach in Sean Payton with a Broncos team that's been on an upward trajectory over recent years. I think the first 2 weeks, very favorable for the Broncos, especially that week 2 matchup. And again, as I said, for defense and special teams, it's really week to week. You want to play it based off the matchup. For me, I pretty much just go, and each week I will just look at, okay, who's playing who, and what do I think is the most lopsided matchup? And then I go, okay, the team that I think is going to win that lopsided matchup, if I can, I want their defense. And if that defense is already taken, I just go down the list of the most lopsided matchups, and I go until I can find that defense that's available. Whether I've already drafted them or they're on the waivers, I'll go take them. And so for the Broncos, you do have that benefit for them that at the very least, week 1 and 2, they should have pretty good matchups. They'll be good for you weeks 1 and 2. And then maybe after that, you can evaluate and see week to week from there on the waivers. So that's a fair reason to take the Broncos first. But, that's why I said with my tips with tight ends, with defense, again, for the most part, even in the draft, and then week to week throughout the season, you really want to go based off a matchup. You don't want to put too much value into how much points that particular defense has already gotten thus far that season, because defenses are very inconsistent week to week, and it often very much correlates with the opponent they had and how good or bad of an offense that team had. So, moving on to number 10 on this list, I have number 2 on this list is the Pittsburgh Steelers. On average, they're going third for defenses with an average draft position of 130. So I'm slightly higher on the Steelers than the average. And part of that is, of course, because of Mike Tomlin. Always got that defense going at least pretty decent. The Steelers did finish 2023 11th for defense. So, not great bottom starting level defense. And again, certainly at that level, definitely one that you just want to be streaming week in and week out. In 2024, though, they did finish 6th, so they were a team that, for the most part, they weren't on waivers really too often in 2026 or 2024. But they do have a lot of talent up front on that defense. But with that considered, they were a bit disappointing in the sack department for 2024, but either way, I do expect them to be one of the top defenses. I do think they could be a top 5 defense this season. And another reason for possibly drafting them and drafting them early for defenses is that they do have a favorable looking start to the season. So their start week 1 through week 3 is at the New York Jets, at home against the Seahawks, and then they're on the road against the Patriots, which that one could maybe be surprisingly tough. All these could maybe be tough. The Jets, you've got Justin Fields, who could end up running a lot, could end up running and getting some rushing touchdowns on you. But yeah, as far as a starting schedule goes, first 2 or 3 weeks, that's a pretty favorable one with a defensive head coach and a decent defensive roster. So that's a fair defense to draft early on, at least as far as defense goes. At number 3 on this list, I have the Minnesota Vikings. On average, they're going 5th for defenses. It's a defense that's led by Brian Flores, which has surged. They surged early on in 2024, and their scoring kind of digressed a little bit, but I do expect them to be good again this year. Their early matchups in weeks 1 and 2 are I don't know about favorable, but they're middling matchups as far as offense goes. That being on the road against Chicago, which, Chicago for the Bears, you've got Caleb Williams, who took a lot of sacks in 2024. Of course, the Bears have done a lot to try to mitigate that and get away from that, but certainly there's going to be a progression to it, and a very much new offensive line in the middle, although full of a lot of veterans that the Bears traded for. And then you've got the Atlanta Falcons. So both teams that are maybe not expected to be the worst this season as a whole and on offense, but not necessarily top tier. So as far as matchups go, and also being that it's early on in the season, we really don't know. There's all sorts of speculation about each team, but a lot of it is based off of how you were in previous years and what you did in the off season. And again, it's all speculation. There's always some surprises in the early parts of the year, especially just because sometimes even the teams that end up being great in the end have slow starts. So as far as matchups, it can be, again, for defense, you want to go very much matchup based, but early on in the season where it can be hard to predict, going with a team that has a well-known defensive coordinator in Brian Flores, defense that had success in the previous season, and has some favorable or middling matchups, is a good move in the draft. So again, going 5th overall on average for defenses at pick 142 on average currently, and I've got them 3 on my list, so I'm a little bit higher than the average. At number 4 on my list, I have the Philadelphia Eagles defense. They are on average going 2nd as a defense, so I'm a little low on the Eagles defense. Their early season matchups are part of why I'm so low on them. They start with Dallas at home, on the road against the Chiefs, then they're back at home against the Rams, and then they are on the road against the Buccaneers. So a good amount of defenses in there. Really, all 4 defenses in there. All 4 of those opponents' offenses we expect to be semi-good, if not middle of the pack at worst. So, and it's September, so it's warmer weather in the outdoor stadiums. So, I do think that for the Eagles, not really the greatest matchups there for you for fantasy. The Eagles should be one of the better defenses matchup-wise later on, but through September, not the easiest schedule for defense, so that's why I'm not as high on drafting the Eagles as the average. Number 5 on my list, I have the Baltimore Ravens. They are going 4th on average, at average draft position at 131 currently. A very historically strong defense year to year, of course. For many years now, under John Harbaugh, they've pretty much always had a strong defense as a franchise. And they are a defense that does boast some All-Pros, including Marlon Humphrey and linebacker Roquan Smith, and second team All-Pro safety Kyle Hamilton. And they've added some other pieces as well that should bolster their secondary, which was a bit of a weakness for the Ravens defense. And the Ravens do have a generally sound schedule with 2 games each against their division rivals in the Browns and the Steelers, both teams that we don't necessarily expect to have the greatest of offenses, and those are matchups that in that AFC North. Those matches between those three teams often end up being slugfests and defensive matchups. So those could be interesting for you on defense with the Ravens. But my problem with drafting the Ravens as high as they're going is their Week 1 matchup. It is on the road against the Bills, which I expect to, I and many obviously we're going to expect that to be at least somewhat of a shootout. Certainly a close game. It could be a low one, but I would lean towards that being a shootout. And so, you got great defenses for both teams. I don't like that matchup. So, and especially for how high the Ravens are getting drafted for defense, mainly because they're a franchise that's known for defense. I think they're getting a little overdrafted. At number 6 on this list, ninth on average for defense, is the Houston Texans. Their ADP currently is at about 150. Sure to be popular defense and special teams sleeper this year. The Texans are led by a list of all pros, including Derek Stingley Jr., Will Anderson Jr., and Danielle Hunter, as well as some free agents that they added in 2020 in the offseason. And also, I should mention, Will Anderson Jr. and Danielle Hunter both had double-digit sacks in 2024, so very sack-heavy team in Houston. The Texans do face a tougher earlier schedule, though, which is one problem for them. They'll start on the road against the Rams, and then at home against the Buccaneers in weeks 1 and 2. And then they also do have Baltimore in weeks 5, and then they've got a bye week on week 6. So they've got some okay matchups in week 3 and 4, on the road against Jacksonville, and at home against the Titans. So weeks 3 and 4, they might be a great defense to have, but outside of those 2 weeks early on, some pretty tough matchups there. So that is why they are going 9th on average. They're a little higher on my list at 6th. But, again, I'm not too confident, don't necessarily love them there. And again, this is why for me, even, the 5th defense on my list here, like the Ravens, the Texans, I would prefer to, if I'm taking them, I'm not really going to be confident in my pick unless I'm able to get them, last couple rounds of the draft, which chances are I'm not going to get them because they're going to be taken way earlier than I'm comfortable with taking. And that's fine. Defense for me might be a bit of a struggle in weeks 1 and 2, but I've generally been really good. One of the top teams in all my leagues every year at week-to-week defense. So even though the first week might be a struggle for me, week 2, week 3 on, I'm usually really good as far as defense on my fantasy teams. At number 7 on my list, 6th overall, is the Kansas City Chiefs. They're going at an average draft position of 147. They did finish 6th for defense in 2023, but they were quite a bit worse in 2024. 2023, they finished with 140 points, and in 2024, they finished with 98 points. Steve Spagnuolo's defense is, of course, very sound. They're very much about bend, don't break, all about point prevention, which obviously is the goal in any defense, but they're not like an overly aggressive defense for turnovers or for sacks. They play sound defense. They know how to keep you out of the end zone. They know how to play defense to set themselves up for a win and often play in close games. But yeah, they're just not a team that necessarily is always going to light it up with stats that are going to give them fantasy points. But they are going to be drafted well just because they've had some decent years on defense in the last 5 years, and they're the Chiefs, a well-known team, very successful team over the last few years. So, that's why they're getting drafted 6th overall. I would draft them 7th. And then moving on to 8th on my list, I have the Buffalo Bills. They are at 8th on the average draft, with an average draft position of about 149 overall. Bills general manager Brandon Beane has, been a man of his word this offseason. They've built up the defensive line, which finished 2024 with only 39 sacks. So a far cry from what they've been in past years, and certainly a bit of a disappointment with the way they're built with a defensive head coach and those sort of things. But yeah, they've done a lot to bolster that up this offseason, so you could expect them to improve, certainly in the sack department, and therefore maybe some better fantasy numbers. My problem is some of their matchups early on in the season, mainly in week 1 against the Baltimore Ravens. After that, though, after week 1, the Bills might not be a bad defense for you, because in week 2, they're on the road against the Jets. Then they're at home for 3 games in a row against the Dolphins, the Saints, which that one, any team that is playing against the Saints, I am going to be going after their defense pretty much every week. So, yeah, they have the Ravens, they're at the Jets, then they're at home against the Dolphins, Saints, Patriots, and then they're on the road against the Falcons. So, first 6 weeks of the season seem semi-favorable for the Bills. If they end up having a good defense this year, those could all be pretty good matchups for them, and certainly that week 4 matchup against the Saints. Number 9 on my list, 16th on average for defenses. So in many leagues, they're not even going to be getting drafted, in most, as a matter of fact. They do have an average draft position of 167. The Seahawks did finish 7th for defense in 2024. This is due mostly to some good matchups they had last year. But I do have them. The reason I have them much higher than their average is because I like their matchups in week 2 and 3. So they do start the season against the San Francisco 49ers, which is tough because it's a division rival. One way that I could see that going well for the Seahawks defense is that the 49ers have a lot of issues coming into the season at wide receiver. So there's a possibility that could work out for the Seahawks defense. But then they're on the road against the Steelers, and they're at home against the Saints. So again, another team that has a game against the Saints. So at least in week 3, I'm going to want the Seahawks. Maybe not necessarily going to be drafting them, but at least on waivers, I will be watching out for them. At number 10 on my list for defense and special teams, I have the Green Bay Packers. They finished 3rd in 2024, and that was a lot of production out of the talent they had in 2024. And of course, as everybody knows, if you've been following any NFL news in the recent days, the Dallas Cowboys recently traded with the Green Bay Packers in a blockbuster trade. And the Green Bay Packers, to my chagrin, now have Micah Parsons. So they've added a top-line defensive end. I am not excited about that as a Bears fan. But for fantasy value, though, that adds some value to the Packers. And I'm sure their average draft position in the last couple of days has gone up quite a bit since they added Micah Parsons. Whether fair or not, there's going to be some hype around them just because of that. Now, to be fair, with Micah Parsons, of course, he has missed, being with Dallas, sat out basically all of training camp, wasn't practicing, sat out a lot here in the offseason program, and he's now just getting with the Packers. So I do expect him to have a little bit of a slow ramp up in the first few weeks, but certainly at the very least by week 4, the Packers are on the road against Dallas. A good defense or a good offense, but you already know that the Packers are going to want to have Micah Parsons definitely ready. The Packers are going to be rallying around Micah Parsons, and they're going to want to go show up the Cowboys, who, they certainly showed the Cowboys up in the playoffs a couple seasons ago, and really the Cowboys have been kind of spiraling since. So, and a lot of this trade, honestly, if you look back through the Cowboys' moves in the last couple of years since their defeat in the playoffs to the Packers, a lot of what happened with this trade kind of you could trace back to that game. So, I do expect the Packers' defense could be surprisingly good, certainly for the fact that on average they're only getting drafted 10th for defenses. At number 11 on my list, I have the New England Patriots. They are on average getting drafted 24th for defense with an average draft position of 172. Most of the time with that, they're not going to be getting drafted at all, although I think they should be, because their first 4 matchups for the teams that they're playing are really cupcake matchups. If there's any matchups in the first month of the season that look favorable, the Patriots have a good roster here. So they start at home against the Raiders, then they're on the road against the Dolphins. Now that is on the road in Miami. It'll be hot and all that kind of stuff. So Miami might have the advantage there with the weapons they have. Even though Miami has a lot going on, I don't think they're going to have the greatest season. It will be early on in the season. Should be that heat depending on the weather. Could be very hot. So the climate could be a bit of an advantage for the Dolphins at that time of the year. But yeah, so you're at home against the Raiders, on the road against the Dolphins, which outside of that weather advantage and it being a division game, again, I don't think the Dolphins would be very good. Then you have at home against the Steelers and at home against the Panthers. So that's 4 games that, again, kind of middling at best out of those 4. So even though the Patriots as a whole, not very highly rated, I mean, they didn't do very well at all in 2024. So that's why. But for me, if I was to draft them at all, which I'm not saying that I will, the reason I will either be drafting them super late because they're available, or I'll be looking for them on the waiver wire after the draft, is because they've got some favorable matchups coming up here in September. At number 12 on my list, so really the last defense that I'm calling starter worthy in the draft, which again, all these defenses, again, any defense you take, either draft them based off of you really think they're going to be a top defense, or you think they've got a decent matchup or set of matchups in the first month, or at this point you're just the last person drafting defense, which who knows, could be me, depending on how things go in certain drafts. But at 12, I do have my Chicago Bears defense. So the Bears' defensive strength going into this year certainly looks to be starting with their two-time All-Pro cornerback Jalen Johnson out of Utah. Of course, because of that, me being from Utah and being a Bears fan, I've always loved Jalen Johnson. He's been a great defensive back for the Bears, outside of a few times of having some injuries that he dealt with, certainly in 2024. But, the defense also did add Grady Jarrett to the front of the defense, which should hopefully help in the run game. That's one area that the defense for the Bears has struggled in the past year or two when they had Matt Eberflus as the head coach. That is the other thing that does change, is the Bears now have defensive coordinator that's going to be mainly over defense, and that is Dennis Allen, the former Saints former Saints coach, and really the Saints, some of their best defenses in the past decade were under Dennis Allen. So I certainly think that the Bears defense could be improved depending on some of the mainly thanks to some of the talent that they've brought in, but also could be with Dennis Allen changing things up a little bit as well. But yeah, so for me, they do also, of course, have a semi-competitive schedule, and certainly in the division of the NFC North. And also just the NFC North, the divisions that they're all playing this year makes for a bit of a difficult season. So, that part will be tough. And again, that's why I have the Bears down at 12th. But I do think they could be a good defense and certainly competitive against favorable matchups that'll come later on in the season. At 13th on my list, going 11th on average, I have the Detroit Lions. Their average draft position at 156. They were without Aiden Hutchinson for most of the season last year, and despite that, the Lions did finish 12th for defense in 2024. So that they'll have Aiden Hutchinson back healthy. They do, of course, lose Aaron Glenn, who got a head coach position with the Jets because of his work as defensive coordinator. he's been replaced by the former linebackers coach for the Lions, Kelvin Shepard. So we'll have to see how the Lions look with him as the defensive coordinator and with having Aiden Hutchinson back. Assuming he's able to stay healthy, I do expect this Lions defense to be good. But again, being in the NFC North, they'll have some tough matchups to deal with. At number 14 on my list, I have the San Francisco 49ers. They're going 7th on average with an average draft position of 150. They've struggled in 2024. They've also lost some talent this offseason, but they do get Robert Saleh back as their defensive coordinator. So, and they've added a couple pieces here and there. So, and they've retained some talent in, an example, All-Pro linebacker Fred Warner, and then defensive end Nick Bosa. They're both going to be there still as well. So, and then their starting schedule to the season the first 2 weeks, they're on the road back-to-back weeks, but they have the Seahawks and the Saints. So week 2, you already know I'm going to be looking, at least having my eye out for the 49ers on the waivers. And then rounding out this list, number 15 for me for defense, 15 on average. Their average draft position, if they are getting drafted at all, is 166. So again, these are all defenses that are truly getting drafted in that last round or two, which again is where I would like to draft defense anyways. For weeks 1 and 2, they have great matchups. They have at the road against the Saints, and then at home against the Panthers. So, and they've got some pretty good similar matchups going through to week 6. So, the Cardinals, even though they don't have the most potent defense, and they only got 88 points total, fantasy points total as a defense last year, they're currently being projected by ESPN to get around 100, which isn't very high for a defense by any means, but their early season schedule looks very favorable. So this is a defense you're likely not going to see drafted, but it's possible, certainly, even after your draft, you could next week, by Wednesday, you could pick them up off of waivers if you'd like for the matchup, or you could wait till week 2 and get them against the Panthers if that ends up looking good. But certainly against the Saints week 1, I'm going to be tempted to draft the Cardinals or pick them up off of waivers just simply because of the fact that they've got on the road against the Saints. And I think the Saints have a high chance to be one of the top 3 worst teams in the league, if not the worst team. I think the Saints are playing for the number 1 overall draft pick in 2025. So with that said, that will end the defense special teams top 15 video for me in fantasy for 2025. That will finish out this series. I may do some more fantasy videos coming up this season, certainly depending on how many likes you give this video, what you say in the comments, and your demand for fantasy videos. I'd be more than happy to do more fantasy content. But otherwise, the next video you can expect from me will be a video on my full season predictions for the 2025 season. That'll include records for every single team. I go through every single team's schedule, and I mark win or loss for every single game. So I'm not like some broadcasters out there that might just give you just guesses. I think this team's going to go 8-8. I think this team's going to go 10-7, and they don't even check their math. And I said 8-8. That's the old schedule. It would be 9-8 or 8-9 now, but you get the point. I actually do the work, and I will show you the spreadsheet, even though it's not going to look pretty. I will show you the spreadsheet in the video of how I came to the results of the standings I get. I'll also give you projections for things like the season MVP and my projections for the playoffs and for the Super Bowl. So that'll be coming up soon this week. Keep an eye out for that. I hope you've enjoyed this video, especially if you've made it this far in. Probably because you have, or you've skipped around, which is fine as well. If you use the timestamps, I'm more than happy with you using those as well. But with that said, you have a great rest of your week, and I will see you in that season 2025 predictions video.